Thank you everyone for joining us for this evening's webinar on military disability retirement. Presenting tonight are Tully Rinckey partners Heather Tenney and Allison Weaver, and Associate Ira Rushing. They'll be providing an overview on the essentials needed in order to receive your military disability retirement. So we'll get things started, and I'll turn things over to our presenters, who will just have to unmute their microphones. Thank you.
Hi, this is Allison Weber. So just kind of want to talk a little bit about the roadmap of what we're going over here. So what is a disability retirement? Basically, if you are physically unfit to perform your duties, you could be either medically separated or retired from your applicable service branch. If you're retired, you're eligible for retired benefits from the DoD, which covers everything from compensation, healthcare, and other retiree benefits, just as though you're retiring for a term of service. The amount would differ, but essentially you have full retirement benefits. Medical separation, on the other hand, means you're medically separated. It's for a medical condition. However, you're not at the level necessary to get a medical disability retirement. So the first question that normally comes up is, what does it mean to be physically unfit for service? Where we start there is the Department of Defense lists the conditions in DoD Directive 1332.38 that disqualify you from duty. Not an exhaustive list. So if you think that your condition is unfitting and it's not in there, you know, again, it's not everything. Each branch has their own regulations and instructions that can include other conditions as well. Basically, though, what we're looking for are medical conditions that substantially impact your ability to perform your job, specifically the duties required by your grade and your military occupation, anything that is required for you to perform your duties, grade, rank, and position is normally how I say it. So if you think you're unfit, I mean, the first thing normally is, are you profiled? Some people list this, are you on limited duty? Do you have some restrictions on what you can do? That's normally the starting point. And how long you're on those limitations is also a driving factor in when you begin the actual medical evaluation board process. So essentially, if you think you're medically unfit, first of all, you got to see your doctor and start getting profiled. But you go through an extensive process. The first is that you have to be deemed, your conditions medically disqualifying starts the process. So the profile could be a temporary one, but if you've been profiled for a year, that's when you really get kicked into the process. Some conditions will go faster if they don't expect you to recover, but otherwise, if you've been profiled consistently for a year, you typically would transition into the actual MEB process. So just because you're unfit does not necessarily, as I said, mean you're going to be medically retired. That is how we get into the MEB. When you get to the MEB, all the conditions you think are disqualifying are going to be put in, and they're going to say whether they are or not. That's only step one. So if you have a disqualifying condition, then you continue into the process. The next question, though, is, are you actually unfit? So there are some disqualifying conditions you can have that you can continue to serve. It depends. So you could have a condition that is completely managed by medication and it doesn't impact you at all. In that case, you can be returned to duty and continue on. On the other hand, if you're not fit, then you go into the PEB phase, physical evaluation board. The key for getting a medical disability retirement is going to be whether or not your actual disabling conditions, that's going to be a key point later here, whether the disabling or unfitting conditions actually reach 30%. Not all of your conditions, as many know, when you go through the VA process, you're going to get percentages for a number of conditions, but the military is basing the decision on a medical disability retirement on only those that are unfitting for service. So the key number, the magic number, is 30%. The other piece, though, that is very important, and again, we're kind of going to jump around here a little bit, but is that the unfitting condition has to be designated as in the line of duty. So just to kind of start there, If you're active duty, that's typically not an issue unless there is some reason to believe that the injury was caused or illness was caused somehow by your own misconduct. If you were in an AWOL status, things of that nature. But as an active duty person, your conditions are going to be presumed to be in the line of duty, and you don't need documentation. If there's suspicions around it, then they would do a line of duty investigation. If, on the other hand, you're a reservist or guardsman, it becomes more complicated. Then the question is not only going to be, did it occur? I mean, obviously, some things are obvious, right? If you go to drill and you get injured, I don't know, you fall off a truck and break your leg, right? That's pretty obvious. The injury occurred while you were at duty performing duty. That would be in the line of duty. You still, I want to highlight this specifically, request paperwork, request that someone put together paperwork saying you were in the line of duty. Seems obvious, but let's not leave anything to chance. Where it gets more complicated are conditions, like for instance, chronic conditions, things that can result over time. A lot of times you're talking about cancers or lung disease or things, again, being exposed to chemicals, things that happen during service that very well could be caused by your service, but it's not as obvious. So if you have a condition like that, you definitely want to pursue a line of duty. It's a process. You have to request it. The command is involved, medical is involved, and at some point legal is involved in order to go through all of the wickets to determine whether or not the condition is in the line of duty. If it's not, and you believe it is, it's very important for you to appeal that decision. And I just recommend that you then consult someone about that. At the end of the day, if the condition is not in the line of duty, you can still be medically separated, but you would not then get a disability retirement or compensation from the military for the condition. So it is critical, if you think your condition, your unfitting condition is in the line of duty, that you actually pursue that. And you want to do that sooner rather than later. Technically speaking, there are limits on when you file for your line of duty. There are exceptions to many of those rules, but if you don't have to use them, you don't want to. So that is the first real step in the process for guardsmen and reservists. And if you have issues with your unit in terms of getting a line of duty, then again, you want to make sure that you reach out to get support either through other members of your own channel, chain of command, medical, legal office, or reaching out to a civilian attorney to assist.
Now, as Allison was talking about in terms of line of duty, line of duty is really basically, though, just an administrative tool. It's not, it's not specifically going to determine that you are in fact medically retired, but it can become necessary. It's a necessary determination in order for there to be a determination of what your status is as a service member at the time of the injury, illness, disability, or even in the case of death, they do in the line of duty determinations. Now, as Allison was talking about a little bit, for active duty personnel, there's not always going to be a line of duty determination because there is a presumption that if an injury condition arises while you're on an active duty, that's going to be considered in the line of duty unless there's some sort of question about whether you were engaging in some sort of misconduct, whether you were AWOL at the time of the injury or illness, or if there's a suspicion about the existence of it prior to service. But then if your service is long enough, and this is what, in the previous slide, it talked about what the 8-year rule is. In general, if you have been serving on active duty for 8 years and you had pre-existing conditions, they are now presumed to be in the line of duty regardless of, additional evidence necessary. If it's under that time, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be considered in the line of duty, but you're probably going to have to provide more information to support how service aggravated the injury, not just that you have the injury. Now, in terms of our service members who are in the reserves and National Guard, line of duties are essential because there is not a presumption that an injury that is, that you have suffered is going to be considered in the line of duty in all instances. It's going to be very much based on status. So there are definitely things that are very important in terms of what you do as a reservist or guardsman who, is injured while either serving in a qualified duty status or ultimately has a diagnosis that they believe occurred in a qualified status. And Allison might be able to speak a little bit more to the process by which you as a guardsman or a reservist can try and help that process along in trying to make sure that you get a line of duty investigation.
Yeah, so I touched briefly on this. The first step, obviously, is make sure someone knows that there's an issue. So if you injure yourself, this is not the time to pretend that you didn't. This is definitely the time you want to let someone know. The person who is supposed to initiate the process, you go to your chain of command. So if you are enlisted, you normally go through your regular chain, go through squad leader, platoon sergeant, get to the first sergeant, get to the commander. That's who's actually going to start the process for you. Officers would still go, but they normally just go to the commander. That's where the process starts. But as I mentioned, if you are having problems, if they're giving pushback, if they say anything about, oh, this isn't needed, don't stop there. That is not the answer. One thing, especially if there's pushback, you would want to do is anybody who saw you get injured, this is more so again for the injury versus a chronic condition of some kind, but anybody who saw you get injured, ask if they will write you a statement saying what they saw, or at least keep their contact information handy. You may need it down the line. If once you get through the command, though, they start the paperwork, they ask you how you're injured, they fill it out, and then that's when medical gets involved. Sometimes the issue arises where you don't necessarily know what happened yet, right? Like, again, you fall down, your knee hurts, but you don't know if it's a serious injury or not. Again, at least let someone know that you've been injured. You don't get lines of duty for knee pain or I got a bruise or I have a tummy ache. Like, those are not going to be line of duty conditions. You do need a diagnosis. But if you can at least establish that an incident occurred, it will be much easier when down the line you ultimately do get that diagnosis. And that's one of the crucial parts to the line of duty is the timeline. You were supposed to request it within 180 days of being released from your qualified duty status. So for instance, if annual training ends on the 13th, 180 days from the 13th is when you're supposed to have requested any line of duty. Now, in the civilian world or even in the VA side, anything you're doing in regular medical care that's not at the clinic, or even for that matter, if you are at the clinic, it could take you more than 180 days to get the appropriate testing and diagnosis. And that's, again, why I go back to let them know right away so that you can at least show that you've requested it, even if you don't have all of the necessary pieces yet. But basically, you're going to go to the command, they'll start the paperwork, they'll go to medical, they'll piece all of that together where you get the diagnosis, they combine it, and then it goes through the review or investigative process. Some things, it's very simple. If they don't think this is going to be a long-standing condition that will require, the government to pay out for years to come, then it can, in many cases, be approved at the local level. But if this is something that's extremely likely to be an unfitting condition with claims down the line, then it has a much more extensive review process with the National Guard, for instance, all going up to NGB, and the reserves going back up through HRC. So it's an extended process. Many people can shoot it down. And as I said, a lot of times where this becomes significant is you have to appeal. You're going to have to get into the appeal process. If they say it's not in the line of duty or existing prior to service and not service aggravated, it's just another fancy way for saying not in the line of duty. At the end of the day, you need it to say line of duty or service aggravated. That's going to be the necessary piece. So if you're having problems, again, you can use the leadership. You can try to go to a legal assistance if you have one in your unit handy. You can go to IG if they're fighting you, but you can also obviously reach out to a civilian attorney to step in if you can't get anywhere. Because as Heather said, you have to have the line of duty in order to get into that medical disability retirement process.
Another thing that, as Allison was saying, obviously, and not in every instance is it going to be immediate that, oh, this is a condition that I'm going to ultimately be medically retired for. But, you know, a lesson that should be taken from all of this is that be more mindful of when you do suffer some sort of injury while you're, even if it is those things where, hey, I fell down when we were on the ruck. Don't be so cavalier as to be like, it's no issue, because we have seen repeatedly where people later and down the road, that knee issue winds up becoming an issue that may ultimately make them unfit, but there's no record of it now. So even if you're not ultimately looking for a true line of duty investigation or reporting things and getting records and treatment that shows that you were in a covered status is important. Another offshoot of this also is, and why the line of duty can be important, not only just for the process of getting referred into the medical disability retirement process that we're going to talk about here in a couple minutes, but also if you say are on active duty orders as a traditional guardsman or reservist, and an injury occurs and you're seeking to be continued on orders in order for medical treatment, that's going to have to be a line of duty injury. Also, too, if they are going to seek to release you, but you're ultimately not going to be able to return to your civilian job, then you're probably going to be looking for what they call incapacitation pay, and a line of duty determination is required in order to process that line of that incapacitation pay request. So not having those can often hold you up. And what also can be held up is your continued treatment for that condition. So you might actually be paying out of pocket if you can't get them to do that line of duty. So that's why it's so critical that sometimes your command may be dragging their feet or might not even know what to do. And that's why you have to sometimes be more proactive in the process. So in terms of, you know, we obviously have situations, and Allison talked about it, where there may be a time when you're found not in the line of duty. Well, just because you're found not in the line of duty doesn't mean you agree that you are not in the line of duty. And that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. There is an appeals process. Usually from the time you receive that denial, you have 30 days to submit appeal, depending on, you know, what your status is. If you're a traditional guardsman or a reservist, that will depend on where the appeal goes. On the National Guard side, it's usually going up through the National Guard Bureau. On the reserve side, it's obviously going up through Reserve Command, ultimately to be making that determination. And that often is something that you're going to need assistance with, because obviously there's now a presumption that it's not in the line of duty because they've made that determination. So you're often having to cull through the medical records, develop more even sometimes non-medical evidence in terms of support from witnesses that can ultimately share information to support why that condition should be not found in the line of duty, not, and appeal the not in line of duty determination.
Actually, really quickly, Heather, one thing I said earlier was if you've been injured, again, if you know somebody saw it, get a statement and stuff. Something I kind of glossed over that it probably shouldn't be glossed over is if you're injured, go to the clinic, get a medical record. I know in a lot of instances, they actually discourage people from doing that. And again, leadership, typically the leaders who are saying this, like, hey, don't go, it's regardless of why they're saying it, it interferes with training, they're just going to harass you about it, whatever. If they're calling sick call rangers, right? Their reasoning has nothing to do with the line of duty. And if it does, they're wrong. Documenting it with the clinic is probably the best evidence you can have. And just so many people don't get treatment. So if it means one day you just go over to the clinic to say, hey, this happened, even if you're just looking for Motrin and an ice pack at the time, at least then it's in your record later. So as Heather said, injuries tend to come back over time, something you could never predict at the time. And most of the time, the biggest problem we run into is that the person said, oh, I was sucking it up, I didn't want to go, or I was told not to go to the clinic. So just, I shouldn't skip that part.
No, and
Well,
absolutely.
and sometimes what's important is understanding that, you know, maybe you can't get to a clinic, maybe you're out in the field or something like that. any of your medical readiness NCOs or anybody in your medical readiness corps in your unit will have what's called a standard form 600. And the SF form 600 is the same across all the different branches, and it's just your chronological record of medical care. So what that does is it memorializes right then, hey, on this date, I fell and I hurt my back and the doctor gave me Motrin, but you have it. And that's kind of like, it's a really important tool that a lot of units don't think of, but they have it. And it gets you in there. It gets you something with a date on it that said you hurt yourself.
And again, this is not just even like, obviously the purpose of this discussion here today is about medical disability retirement, but there's also the VA process and any of this evidence that you collect to show that something occurred while in service is beneficial for your VA claim. So you're always doing yourself a favor by, taking these actions at the time and not trying to, suck it up and rub dirt in it and drink water. That's what we're told. It's usually not, what's ultimately good for us in the long run. So Pat, can you move to the next slide, please? All right, so we talked about the line of duty, and the line of duty is obviously important if we're talking about disability retirement, because we're ultimately talking about whether or not we would be medically retired from our service. And each branch has a little bit different process. I mean, for the most part, the language is relatively similar. So we'll try and be kind of basic and won't use any, specific process and procedure from any one branch. But I think all our panel members here are former Army, so forgive us if we get a little Army specific. In terms of, the referral process, in these cases, you're not often able to do this yourself. It's not like you submit a packet to get medically retired. You are often going to be, this even might not be something that you always want in most instances. This is a situation where ultimately you have some sort of condition or injury that your medical providers or command think makes you unfit, may refer you for medical evaluation. Now, sometimes you do have to be the person who's poking the bear because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But in the ideal world, this is a situation where you may have had some injury or condition, or you went through a course of treatment. That course of treatment is not showing significant improvement, and now they are considering whether or not you should be, in essence, retained based on that status and condition. So there's two general processes when you're going to go through disability retirement, and they're commonly called IDES and LDES, which is the Integrated Disability Evaluation System and the Legacy Disability Evaluation System. Most active duty service members are going to be processed through IDES, the integrated system. And what that is that the service member is going to, in essence, be doing both their processing for purposes of medical retirement or separation and their VA claim at the same time. So they're going to address all their service-connected conditions at the same time. And when they're done, they will either be medically retired or separated, and they will also have their VA rating and, in essence, receive benefits upon exit. It's not a situation where reservists and National Guardsmen necessarily will always want to go through IDES, because many times reservists and guardsmen may also already have a VA rating, and they don't necessarily want to do anything to, look at and fuss around with their current ratings. So they might be happy with it. So you could then elect to go through the Legacy Disability Evaluation System, which allows the service member to retain their current VA rating and should expedite processing. But I'm always very cautious about what the word expedite means when we're dealing with anything involving the military or the government, because it does not have the same definition as people would use for the word expedite. However, there is sort of a tendency that we have been seeing where people are pushed into IDES even when they don't want to be So that's something that you may want to address if you can't get them to listen to you. That might be something that you might want, counsel to help you with, or an advisor to help you with, because there's a tendency to want to push people into IDES, even though they don't need to be there. So anything to add, Allison? I'm sorry.
Actually, on that, if you're considering LDIS in the first place, first they give you a counseling and you have to answer what you want to do. If you want to do LDIS, you actually have to prepare a memo. Pretty much everywhere I've seen seems to have a template ready for you, but you have to explain why you should be allowed to use LDIS, and that has to be approved by, I believe it's the clinic commander in most cases, maybe not all cases, but essentially there is an approval process for the LDIS. So yes, they can turn it down, and the default is IDIS. So you have to be able to give a justification, and it's not supposed to be just because I don't want you to tamper with my VA ratings. Actually, that's the one thing you don't want to write down on the form. It could be anything from the timeliness to it's extremely difficult to get to a VA clinic, things like that. There's a number of things, and again, some of these places have examples, but you do have to justify why they should let you use the alternate process.
So in terms of what it means, so you have some condition that either you've been seeking treatment, or this can even arise as a result of with reservists and guardsmen who have significant VA ratings, and you go through your annual physical and that stuff comes up, you may ultimately be referred for purposes of medical evaluation. Generally, what that is going to entail is you are going to eventually go to an MEB, which is the Medical Evaluation Board. Sometimes this can be avoided by what they call a RILO, which is where they review in lieu of doing the board, but in many instances you wind up going through an MEB. And can we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of the MEB, they are tasked with ultimately preparing a report that documents, your medical history, current status, recommended duty limitations. And the report is going to determine, or at least make recommendations as to whether or not they think that that condition or conditions is going to significantly interfere with your ability to carry out the duty of your rank and rate. And this is generally referred to as whether or not you meet retention criteria. You have the ability to respond to the medical board, and there can obviously be reasons behind why you may disagree with what's presented there. Now, prior to the MEB, though, there's going to be an attempt to gather available and relevant medical records, and there's going to be an informal record review. There's also usually a document prepared that's commonly called the NARSM, which is a narrative summary, and it's basically kind of an executive summary of your. We often see mistakes in the NARSM, and there are opportunities to try and usually will not let you fully correct the NARSM, but you can usually add information to address the errors that are contained. And it can be important because while the narrative summary is not supposed to be a comprehensive example of your entire medical record, a lot of, as this process moves on, people will focus on the NARSM, and if the NARSM is wrong, that can obviously have a negative impact on the overall result. But ultimately, the MEB, the Medical Evaluation Board, is going to decide whether or not the service member is considered fit or unfit. They're also going to make recommendations regarding, line of duty, whether combat related, but kind of the big criteria of the MEB is determining whether there is an unfitting condition. If the service member is found fit, they can be returned to duty. They could theoretically appeal that determination, and ultimately that would be moved on to the next phase. It's also a possibility that you may, as a result of the MEB, ask to do what they call an independent medical review, where you may be seeking, because you disagree with either the conditions that are being referred, the determination, the fitness, like how the treatment has progressed, that you could have an independent medical professional review the information and maybe make decisions that, hey, maybe you shouldn't even be at this point, or maybe there should be other conditions that are referred. And that's usually called a request for an IMR. Anything to add, Allison?
I'll jump in on that. Actually, the IMR has become slightly more limited than it was in the past. It's what Heather just said is often available. The main thing that they're looking for in the IMR side is, are there conditions that should be added that were not addressed at all? If it was, hey, I disagree with how you characterize this, things like that, you're going to be doing that in a rebuttal. But if it's, hey, this just wasn't even touched on, there are other conditions that need to be addressed, need to be on this piece of paper for further consideration. That is the primary purpose right now for the IMR.
Yeah, I've done a couple IMRs where we had some situations where there was not a treatment that had been attempted, and it actually was recommended by one of the medical providers, and the person's goal was to actually get extended for purposes of getting that surgery, and they wound up allowing the person to get the surgery. Now, that's not a common occurrence, but it is something that you could potentially explore with an independent medical review. In terms of, so if you then, whether or not it's the fit or the unfit, and you're now trying to appeal that determination, that's where you then go to what's called the Informal Physical Evaluation Board, or IPEB. And again, similar to the MEB, but now they're going to be making actually like formal decisions. Even though it's called informal, they're making decisions. They are going to, in addition to looking at the fitness, unfitness question, line of duty, whether or not it's considered combat related, they are also going to now add the component of what the rating for those conditions should be. And the ratings are determined by actually the VA. It's from the VA's schedule for rating disabilities. And the rating or percentage will be assigned based on, the unfitting condition, the level of the disability assigned to each. And then there's a formula that ultimately determines the overall rating. Now in IDES, there's going to be also the determination of what your VA claim would be rated as well. Now there's sort of what we call kind of the magic number, right? If you are getting a rating of 30% or higher, you are going to be eligible for disability retirement. Anything less than that, and again, there's not really a less than other than 0, 10, and 20, because they don't do partial ratings, they round the whole number. But if you're getting a 20% rating or a 10% rating, you will likely be given severance, or depending on your status, there might not be anything that's going to happen. So that's a consideration for potentially appeal. In terms of when the informal PEB comes back, you have the opportunity to make certain elections with regards to whether you're appealing, whether or not you want to submit matters back to the informal PEB, whether or not you want to appeal the VA portion. And that's very important that you exercise those election rights timely, because obviously it can affect whether or not, those decisions become final. Allison?
The one caveat, and this is like more of a technical thing, fitness, unfitness technically is PEB, but it is the same general concept as Heather's been talking about. The MEB is going to say medical disqualified, whereas the PEB does the fit and unfit. That's just in case you personally have been in a situation where they're using both phrases. But no, absolutely. Once you get to the informal PEB and they designate the fit, unfit, it is absolutely crucial to pay attention and make sure that you agree with that. And the percentage, a lot of times you have to argue the fitness to get out of the severance. And I say that if you have multiple conditions and the one is the main unfitting condition, for instance, is 10%, you're not going to be able to probably change the 10% unless there is a dramatic difference in your condition that they just missed entirely. Because again, that's going to be coming through the VA side. It's not impossible, but sometimes it's actually better to argue that a second condition is unfitting to build up the percentages that way, again, if applicable. But the one note I wanted to make on the severance is a great idea. It's a good thing, and most people want it.
Allison, let's not jump ahead because we're actually talking about severance specifically a little bit.
That's later? Okay, never mind.
So one of the things I was going to say, an easy way for everybody to think of it big picture, is that the MEB is a medical process and the PEB is a personnel process, right? So the MEB is really just going to take all of the findings of conditions that may make you unfit for duty and then submits that to the PEB that takes a personnel action against, with those findings and says, okay, you either are or you aren't, whatever.
That's a good point. Yes.
Hey, Allison, you want to walk through the formal PEB?
Okay. The formal PEB, this is your opportunity to actually present your case to a board. So you have, when I say an in-person appearance, I do want to hedge that with in-person, depending on the branch, can mean literally in person. It could also mean a video. Some of them are doing them via Zoom, and some of them are simply doing a conference call. So it is your opportunity, though, to present your case to the formal board. 3 members, medical provider is on that. There is also a lot of times a line officer, but there's 3 members that will consider it. One of the most important things that I personally have noticed is making sure that the MEB file, the file that goes to the PEB, you want to make sure that that actually is the scope of medical records that you have that you believe are relevant. In a lot of cases, the MEB file or what becomes the PEB file will say is 200, 300 pages, when if you got your own medical records, it could be 2,500 pages. They're pulling what they believe is the relevant material. You likely have more. And if you're arguing, especially for a different condition being unfitting, you need to make sure that you're actually presenting all of that evidence. So you get to go to the PEB. And again, timelines are important. They give you all these notices of when you can submit materials, making sure your records are there normally before you show up. And that's when you get to argue, these are my conditions. This is why I believe they're unfitting. Again, presuming you're going that way. If you want to argue you're fit, you do that. But this is why I believe I'm fit or unfit. You can present witnesses. Some of the things we've seen come up a lot lately are where someone has been profiled. I think most people have heard of a dead man's profile, right? You have, we'll say, a back problem and you get a dead man's profile. If you also have a knee problem and don't also go get a profile for that, because why would you? You're already profiled. A lot of times the board will say that that condition therefore doesn't seem unfitting because you didn't need one. So this is one of those places where you're going to say, okay, this is why I didn't have it, but these are the ways that specifically this condition interferes with my ability to perform my duties. And this is, again, a lot of times where you want a witness, whether it be your commander, your NCO, someone who can attest to the limitations that you do have. And you can submit evidence in a variety of ways, but that is your chance to actually push forward everything you have. Put it on the line and say, this is what, this is my limitations, this is what I believe, and get them to see the whole picture. Because again, what they've been given up to that point is a snapshot. And that is probably the biggest thing nobody's prepared for. And I do highlight that especially to reservists and guardsmen who have far more civilian records than military. Sometimes that's even worse because trying to chase down your records at the last minute, not realizing they weren't in your file, is very difficult. So you do want to spot that early and make sure you get everything to really show the full scope of how your condition is affecting you. And for the formal PEB, they do assign an attorney. The military's branches do put you in contact with a military attorney, who that is their role, is to do the formal PEBs. They will give you all the information on how to get in contact them. The one thing that I just like to inform people, they typically meet with you the day before. That is, like, it's not that they won't communicate with you, but that is normally your prep time is going to be the day before. So just don't be surprised by that. And you get to have them either way, even if you do retain civilian counsel. For the most part, like there are some caveats to that, but just it is an option for the formal PEB. So do either of you have other specific thoughts on that?
No, I don't. In terms of, though, obviously the result, obviously, like we were talking about before, if you get 30% or higher, you are considered medically retired. Now, the board, though, can decide that they don't have enough information at this point, and they can't make a decision on sort of the stability of the condition, and they could put you on the TDRL, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. But the big issue, obviously, is if you get a rating that is, 0, 10, or 20%, and what do you do? Now, some branches allow you to petition to the president of the board. They may allow you to do a petition for review. Ultimately, if none of that is successful, there are opportunities to appeal to what they call the Physical Disability Review Board, or the Board for the Correction of Military or Naval Records. And we'll talk about those in a couple minutes, because they're also important for purposes of people who may be discharged and then looking back want to try and seek out disability retirement. Now, Allison mentioned a minute ago when we were talking briefly about severance, the term severance, versus obviously disability retirement. Now, like we said, obviously, if you are over 30% or 30% or over, then you're going to be medically retired. If you are under, you will often be receiving severance, but there is a little bit of a catch with severance. So people sometimes are excited to hear that they're going to get this big lump sum of cash, and it's usually not an insignificant number. So people are really happy about that. However, ultimately, if you're receiving that, and you also then have a VA rating as well, that they will ultimately seek to recoup those funds. So in essence, severance becomes kind of an upfront loan. So many people are often told through this process, at least as far as we're told, that they are often discouraged from appealing, say a 20% rating, because they may lose their severance. But you have to think about it as a calculated risk, because ultimately severance is really kind of an upfront loan. So is it worthwhile to gamble that upfront loan in order to potentially get medically retired? Probably in most instances, that would be a good risk. Anything you wanted to add on for purposes of the severance?
No, I was actually going to say another way to consider it is it's an advance, and that is the one thing many people have told me, like they were never informed. They're completely blindsided by the idea that that money is not then going to come back again through the VA. So being here, you get that information now, but they often do not bring that up. So
Pat, can we have the next slide? So when I just mentioned the temporary disabled retired list, or TDRL. So like I said, sometimes they can't, in essence, make a decision about, sort of the level of stability of the condition. So they will place a service member on a temporary disabled retired list, which will then be reevaluated again in the future. What is important to know about this, obviously it's not necessarily a bad thing to be placed on the TDRL, although ideally you would like to be, permanently medically retired. But what is very important to know is that often in these circumstances, when you are reevaluated, many people see a decrease to the point where they are then not eligible for retirement anymore. So they are reduced, below 30%. Now, that is not, though, just a decision that they make without any sort of action. You are given notice and an opportunity to have a formal PEB on that issue if necessary. So it's important to, take those steps and not just assume that it's an automatic. Also, it's important to, continue to seek out treatment for your conditions and develop a record of continuing problems related to your condition, because that's often what they use in order to support that people are, in essence, better.
And one of the things to remember too is that the formal PEB will assign a rating based on the current statutory framework for where your rating should be at, not whatever was in effect at the time of your injury. So as the laws change, so too can your rating.
The other point to highlight, if you're on the TDRL, absolutely pay attention. If they tell you to go to an evaluation, you must go. Do not risk missing one. Anything that is mandated is vital for you to do so that you don't, again, lose the retirement option. So.
Now, in terms of the difference, obviously, if you are not put on the TDRL and you are put on the permanent disabled retired list, you should not expect to be reevaluated. But, ultimately, you will still probably have continuing ongoing evaluations of those conditions, but as part of your VA service-connected compensation to a degree until it's determined to be, permanent by their standards. So in terms of, if you are in fact medically retired, you also are generally, because we talked about with IDES, and even if you're not going through IDES, you often have a VA claim as well. So these two benefits they have a different standard. They're not exactly the same. Like we've consistently talked about line of duty here. The VA uses a term that they call service connection. Those are not the same thing. And now sometimes they can be used to help if you're subsequently trying to get a line of duty determination that the VA may have service connected it, but that is not ultimately the determining factor in whether or not a service branch considers it in the line of duty. Ultimately, when you are seeking VA benefits, they are looking at, whether or not you have a medical condition, whether there's proof that the condition was aggravated or incurred while on a covered period of service, and that there's a nexus between the two. Being say 100% with the VA does not automatically mean, oh, they screwed up, I should have been medically retired. They are different standards, because again, VA is just looking at whether or not you had a condition, there's proof that it was incurred or aggravated by duty, and there's a nexus. They're not determining whether that made you unfit to continue to serve. But sometimes it's a question, especially if you get it, you leave service with no medical disability requirement, and then you have 100% VA rating. Was there something that should have triggered an MEB while you were in service? Now, another big piece of the issue between medical disability and VA is the idea of the compensation. So medical disability retirement payments are considered taxable income unless you're in a state that doesn't tax them. They can be divided in divorce. It's considered income. Whereas VA service-connected compensation payments are generally considered tax-free, and they may be protected in a divorce action. Ultimately, there is a concern too about people will frequently ask about the issue of concurrent receipts. So right now, the current state of the law, VA compensation and medical, military disability retirement do not concurrently receive. There is currently legislation to potentially change that, but there's frequently legislation looking to change it. It hasn't happened up to this point. However, there may be the opportunity for some veterans to receive, in essence, concurrent receipt, but instead, it's by using the term combat-related special compensation. In terms of what that means is they may be entitled if the unfitting conditions that are rated at 10% or more were as a result of you being injured in combat, simulated combat, an instrumentality of war, may ultimately allow you to receive what would have been reduced by what they call VA offset. Anything to add, Allison?
So one of the things I would highlight, first of all, CRSC, the combat related special compensation you have to apply for, it is not an automatic. So the idea, if you want to double dip, concurrent receipt, get paid for both, you do have to apply for it. And combat, I do want to clarify here, means combat. It's not just an injury that happened while in a combat zone. So again, if you think it might be combat related, look into that more specifically. But if it's just something I was on the fob and running, especially like, when they do the little 5Ks or something, that's not going to be a CRSC related injury. But the double dipping is important. The big thing that I would highlight is, depending on how many years of service, there is a cap on how much you can receive. So in some cases, when you run the math, you may or may not actually, like, you could be entitled to CRSC, but the statutory cap actually keeps you from getting any additional money because you already get too much. So it kind of depends in terms of if you are already, so like if your military retired pay exceeds the VA, you don't double dip, but you do get the extra amount on top as taxable. So you get your whole VA amount and then whatever the difference is from the military. Sometimes that difference would then exceed what you could do in CRSC. So again, just because you're entitled doesn't necessarily mean you would still fully get it because of the applicable cap. So that's something that a lot of people aren't tracking. And it's, I don't want to say it's a super complicated math thing, but it has to do with how your disability payments are coming in, VA, military, and which conditions are actually combat connected and how much those are rated. So that's kind of the across the board math on how to determine if CRSC actually gets you anywhere. And sometimes the branches are kind of stingy, I guess would be the way to say, with CRSC. So you may very well have a valid CRSC claim that they deny the first time. Try again. Sometimes they are, I would contend they don't read them or don't fully look through your packet. So don't take the first no as final, especially if you know you've been injured in combat. So
also, too, remember, as you go up in the appeal process for these things, it's not the same people that are making the decision. I don't just mean the same individuals. It's a different process. So with CRSC, after you exhaust your remedy there, you have the ability eventually to go to the board for the correction of military records. So you may receive a more favorable decision based on their analysis than you did at, say, for an example, with the Army, you originally applied for CRSC with HRC. So, you may get a better determination when the board for the correction of military records looks at it vice, HRC.
mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of, we've talked sort of generally about, the idea of going to something like the Board of Corrections. And we've talked about sort of the, the more typical scenario where either an active duty service member or a guardsman or a reservist is injured and they go through this process before ever facing, separation. But sometimes that's not how it happens. Sometimes there are errors that go on in the process, mistakes, even intentional actions that happen that prevent someone from going through the process, or they in fact go through the process, but they get an unfavorable result and they exhaust their initial remedies but don't get the relief that they're seeking. So you can, after discharge seek relief, but you're now not just going and you're not, contacting your commander and saying, hey, refer me into IDES. You're generally going to have to be working through the board for the correction of military or naval records, and you're making an application, much like you would make an application if you were seeking to upgrade an unfavorable discharge or correct another matter in your board of correction, but you're going to have to offer substantially different evidence than when you might be fighting about one of those things versus trying to seek to get medical disability retirement out of one of these boards. There's also a physical disability review board that is usually one of the options, and it actually became kind of there's some level of knowledge about it, because in the last probably 2 decades, there have been a lot of people who were improperly discharged, or at least were discharged with ratings below 30%, particularly in the area of PTSD and TBI. So several years ago, there were letters sent out to people who were affected and gave them the option of applying to the Physical Disability Review Board. In my personal opinion, I am not a huge fan of that board. They, first of all, after they ultimately, their decision is not their own. They ultimately send it back to the service branch to make the decision. And they tend to be a much kind of closed process, so you kind of don't know what's going on, and it seemed to take a very long time. But that is an option when you've actually gone through the MED process and you're disputing what happened during, IDES or LDES. But I probably would go the route of the Board of Corrections or the BCMR or the BCNR.
Just real quick, the PDRB, I do it backwards, I apologize. That if you are discharged between 2001, 2009, that is definitely the area that they're looking at. In some cases, I have seen the Board for Corrections say you have to exhaust it there, but I don't know that that is always the case. Some may get through, so just be aware of that. If you do try to go straight to the Corrections Board, they may kick it back, but it's probably still worth trying. The other thing about the PDVR is that their decision is final, but only with respect to conditions that were actually considered in the original MEB. So if there was other conditions that weren't considered, then you can still take that to the Board for Corrections.
So before we open for questions, from the panelists here, any other thoughts about, things that either from personal experience or things we don't think we covered that would be important for our audience to hear?
One of the things that I've noticed that tends to come up, especially in the context of Guard and reservists, is when you're getting medical treatment for service-connected injuries or things like that from civilian doctors, making sure that you help those doctors understand some of the nuances about military injuries and things like that. There's some additional forms, DA forms and government forms that you need to take to your doctor, but a lot of times we'll see people get to the Board for Corrections, or even if they just get to the PEB and they have all these civilian medical records that were treating these service-connected injuries, but they don't do a good enough job explaining, why or whatever. So that's something to be aware of when you're getting treatment outside of a military medical facility.
Absolutely, that's a very good point. So we've got some questions, and actually, can you go to the last slide? So the first question that we have here is, can pictures be a record? This person talks about how they have evidence of an injury that occurred, but they didn't ever go to medical, but they have a picture of it. Certainly, I mean, obviously photographic evidence could be evidence. Now, obviously there could be an issue though of, either what they call authentication, picture does not necessarily, if it's not time or date stamped, but obviously if it seems to be in the location, it can certainly be part of a larger component of evidence. So certainly photographs can be helpful.
I'll jump in on the next one.
Mhm.
Mental health being caused by a mental health condition being caused by toxic leadership absolutely can be a potential condition. Toxic leadership alone would not constitute a qualifying condition to be the like genesis for a PTSD claim, but it does not mean that it wouldn't contribute to anxiety, depression, adjustment disorders, things of that nature. And if you already have PTSD, obviously that could certainly aggravate it. So it on its own would not be, like I said, the basis for a PTSD, but it absolutely could still cause or contribute to a mental health condition that would be rateable or could be rateable.
I'll hit the next one. So, I mean, this question is kind of about the idea of kind of delays in the process and whether or not there can be compensation due to the fact that the service branch, in essence, dragged their feet. Generally, no, unfortunately. When it comes to the ability to seek out compensation for, in essence, either tort, what they would call a torts or negligence or failure to perform duties. Service members for things that are considered incident to service are not permitted to take legal action for those matters. So no. I'm going to skip the next question. It's a little too specifically personal. Let's see here.
In terms of documents lost on deployment, this would apply technically anywhere they say they lost documents. If you can get any information where they actually say they lost it, someone who would know versus they like just nobody can find it, it'd be great if you can get them to say that. But presumably the point is you just can't locate the records, they're not in your file. This is when you would go back to try to establish the information through lay testimony. Again, your own, anybody you wrote home about and were telling them about problems you were going through, your bunkmate, I don't know, it's your NCO. I don't know if you complained and were constantly running to medical, somebody in your unit very well could write out what they observed and the fact that you were constantly there, if that's what you're looking for to establish that you had a condition. Whether you're looking for the line of duty, the CRSC, again, any of that, you would be going back basically to buddy statements.
Let me actually, I am going to answer the one before. I figure out a way to do it without revealing too much personal. The question involves whether or not if someone was separated in the past and they have a current rating from, I would assume, the VA, that's higher than 30%, would they qualify for a line of duty designation? Not in and of itself. So the problem that would then exist there, if you never actually had a determination that it was in the line of duty, and you never went through any sort of medical evaluation process, you would ultimately be trying to link that, and you would be potentially applying to the Board for the Correction of Military Records. And you would be trying to support that there was evidence in the record that supported that you were unfit at the time and that that injury was in the line of duty. I have seen the Board for the Correction of Military Records and the Board for the Correction of Naval Records sort of what we call split the baby. They will, in fact, I just received a decision like this not that long ago, where if there was never a line of duty done, they may ultimately order the unit that didn't do it to do it now. Now, obviously, very interesting when you're talking about many, many years that might have passed, but that could be a solution that the board proposes. And then if that injury is ultimately considered in the line of duty, then that would necessitate now going back and doing, you know, the LDES or, you know, IDES process. Now, with that, that doesn't mean you go back on active duty while that's happening. They may give you, you know, invitational travel orders to go do things, but you would do this as a civilian. That's not something you would come back on orders for.
There is a question here about how you get a rating in ELDIS if the VA is not involved. If you already have a VA rating and are in the ELDIS process with that, there are many times where the branch will just simply still use the VA ratings you have. However, they're not bound by them in the ELDIS process. Technically speaking, the military branch itself, the PEB you're going through, is vested with the authority to grant the disability percentages on their own. They are still to apply this VA's schedule of rating disabilities. So they're still supposed to use the same criteria as if you were at the VA, but it is the military branch itself. Some of the more significant ones that we see in this, I know I recently would see, is somebody who, for instance, might be a cadet or someone who hasn't, they don't have ratings, but they got pushed into the ELDIS process in a different way. That becomes very challenging because, again, you're now going to try to contest the rating against the branch and you don't have a VA rating to work with as part of it. But that is how it goes. The branch itself is the one who is creating or issuing the rating, and they're doing so supposed to be applying that same criteria.
So next question is, does a permanent and total determination by the VA influence the MEB PEB process? Simple answer, no. However, obviously, like I was saying earlier, if you are, say, in the Reserve and National Guard and you have received 100% VA rating, there is usually a presumption that that's going to initiate at least a inquiry into whether or not your fitness is affected. But the permanent and total classification does not ultimately provide any influence over, DOD in determining whether or not you are, medically retired and unfit. In terms of VA presumptive connections, for purposes of CRSC, not necessarily. Does it ultimately determine that you will be considered combat? In fact, in general, conditions are difficult to establish for purposes of CRSC. They are usually looking for specific causal relationships. So you suffered injury and therefore you have condition. So I know Allison has encountered this with PTSD, right?
Yes, CRSC is very challenging. PTSD is one that we obviously try to push for, and there has been pushback. Again, part of why I was saying don't stop just because they say no is because we've also had issues where it is a direct physical injury and they still say no and are not putting the pieces together. But I would agree overall, being in the combat zone, being exposed generally, normally is not enough. But there may be a specific fact in a given case that would still tie it. But I would say the presumption alone, as Heather said, doesn't necessarily make it combat connected in that sense. So it depends on what it is. There'd be more details needed.
So this person is saying that if they're hearing us correctly, they're saying that you should not get VA disability and get military disability requirement. No, that is not what we're saying. In fact, often they're going to be linked. If you're going through IDES, you're going to be getting both. What we're talking about in terms of the difference between the two is with VA disability, there may not have ever been a determination of fitness. You may just have service-connected conditions. You apply for your benefits and you ultimately get them. With medical disability retirement, you are ultimately in a position where you have been determined unfit to continue to serve and you're going through the process. Now, that unfitness may not ultimately be rated at a percentage where you actually get medically retired, and you still may be eligible for VA benefits, but this is not a situation where it's an either or scenario.
And especially, again, you can be medically retired and receive more money than the VA would give you. So there is still a benefit in many cases to being medically retired, on top of which obviously you get the retirement benefits.
And the eligibility for TRICARE and other retiree benefits that VA service members, VA, connected service members don't have. In terms of this question is about whether or not in applying, again, you're not applying for medical retirement. You're going to be referred based on your command and your medical providers. And they're asking, though, if they encounter something else that they may qualify for. I mean, theoretically, obviously, if you're going through the evaluation process and they find other conditions that may be unfitting, but generally you're being referred into that process because of an unfitting condition, you're often the one who has to fight to try and argue that something else that may exist is also unfitting. This is more of a VA question. It's asking, you know, if you have a service connection rating, why isn't it effective from the date of your discharge? It theoretically can be if you apply early enough. So if you apply for your VA benefits and initiate your claim within, I believe it's a year, it goes back to the date of your discharge. But if you don't do it, if you do it for like 3 or 4 years after the fact, it's going to apply from the date that you applied, not from the date of your discharge.
It just because you have a 30% VA disability rating. So the question is, if I already have the 30% rating, does it qualify me for medical retirement? Again, these are two different things. There are people who have 100% disability rating who do not qualify for medical disability retirement. I know that may sound counterintuitive, but the question becomes, does it prevent you from doing your actual reserve job? So, and also whether that 30% is for a sole condition or whether it's the combination of more than one thing. Again, from a medical disability retirement standpoint, the only conditions that are going to be considered are those that are unfitting, and the percentages tied to those. And those unfitting conditions relate to your ability to perform the duties of your MOS grade and rank. So that's what you're looking at. You very well may qualify, but there's more to it. From a reserve standpoint, what I would tell people, if you believe you have a medical condition that's interfering with your duty, the thing you want to do is you want to, essentially you're looking to obtain a profile or a limited duty status. The reserves typically will take a statement from a non-military provider. So you get your doctor to prepare a record saying this person should not be doing XYZ based upon this condition. By the way, again, just because your civilian doctor says it, don't think that binds the military. It doesn't. But they're recommending that the military consider that and take the action, which would then be to place you on those profiles, limited duty status. That's normally the starting point for being pushed into that system. There are times, for instance, with the Army, that the medical command will audit like records within the system, profiles in the system, and will then generate out MEB notices and such. But again, that's normally triggered by people sending in profile request packets, things saying, I am injured, I have this condition, because of that, I'm requesting to be excused from XYZ. Sometimes it could be just the run portion of a PT test. Other times it could be, I can't perform these other things like ride in a vehicle for X amount of time, wear body armor, various things, whatever you would normally get profiled if you were on an active duty status.
So the next several questions are very, I'm sorry, Ira, go ahead.
I was gonna say I could do the next one real quick just because it's a pretty quick one.
Let me just address though. There's a couple in a row here that are very specific to this person's individual issues, but then somebody actually asked as part of this that does our firm assist with all the items that we're talking about? Yes, absolutely. We represent people for purposes of, you know, fighting with their unit to get lines of duty, appealing negative line of duty determinations, doing actually the whole MEB, PEB process, representing people at boards and doing the after appeal. So certainly we help people. And some of these questions that are very specific related to individual circumstances. Certainly, if you wanted to discuss those matters, please feel free to reach out to us, and you can book your own consultation to address those issues and see if there's a specific way ahead for you. But yeah, go ahead, Ira.
I was going to address the one that asked if there was, if you had another bite at the apple, if the board for the corrections doesn't give you a favorable decision. Yes, you can usually, usually appeals from the board for corrections will go to federal court with some limitations, some time limitations and kind of subject matter limitations. But you can appeal that. You can also request that the board reconsider its decision in cases where maybe there's some evidence that is new and you just got it and it wasn't available for your original petition. That doesn't mean that you can hang out with some evidence in your back pocket as an ace up your sleeve in case you don't get the right thing. But yes, typically there's always another bite at the apple.
And generally, you're going to have to, like I said, offer what they would consider new or and material evidence, but there's often some ways around making that argument. I helped a person ultimately who did 4 applications to the Board of Corrections and finally got relief on the 4th one. I don't really think that there was anything new that we offered in number 4, but you know, sometimes it's just getting a better audience, and sometimes just different evaluation of the underlying issue. So a lot of the questions that are coming up are more VA related, and that's not really the subject of this, so I'm not going to get into those. Again, there's also a lot of questions about the idea of choosing, you know, to go through. It's not really a choice. I mean, ultimately, these are circumstances where you're being referred because there's a concern about your medical fitness. Now, I did, though, see several questions about sort of the distinction between do I want to be medically retired versus, you know, regular retirement. Well, if you have over 20 years on active duty, you're automatically going to receive, you know, regular retirement. And it is beneficial, obviously, to be regularly retired because there is really kind of no question with regards to concurrent receipt as long as your VA rating is 50% or higher. But, you know, again, these aren't really choices. You're not, you know, in essence, having the ability to choose to be medically retired or not. I mean, obviously you could say, okay, fine, I just want to separate, but there would be no reason to do that. You should at least go through the process to determine whether or not you're going to be potentially eligible for these benefits. Let's see.
For reservists, the question is, who are medical providers for reservists that can make referrals? As I pointed out, a lot of times you want to start with your actual regular civilian provider, whoever you normally see, and have them make the request. For the Army, you would send the request straight to the ARMMC. For the other branches, a lot of times what we tell people, if you're not sure, it's essentially like getting a doctor's note, and the next time you go to drill or reach out to your unit, you want to reach out and say, hey, I have this medical issue. You know, who's our doc or who's our medic? Who do I route this through? Medical readiness person. Normally, once you get there, they can get it to the right person if you don't know the answer to that. But at the end of the day, a military medical provider is the person who has to make the ultimate military decision on a particular matter. So reach out to your own unit and ask them that question if you do not know. If it's Army, though, the profile request can go directly to ARMMC.
In terms of, there's somebody who asked about having 20 years in essence of good time for purposes of, you know, a reserve or guard retirement and having 100% VA permanent and total. Asking, is there a benefit to go through the PEB or should it just be waived for reserve retirement? Well, ultimately, if, you know, your conditions that would be considered ultimately in the line of duty are affecting your ability to continue to serve, that is something that you could theoretically be referred into IDES or LDES for. You're not waiving, though. Ultimately, what happens is that the benefit of obviously, you know, getting medically retired is you get medically retired now. You don't have to wait until, if you're in essence a gray area reservist, where you're waiting until you get to be 60 or 58 or whatever, depending on your deployments of when you're going to be able to start drawing. You would then be eligible now. But when you do get to the age where you would have otherwise been able to collect your regular reserve retirement, you will collect your regular reserve retirement.
You may still have to reach out to request it, but yes.
Of course, everything, we have to, that's how it's supposed to go, but sometimes you have to poke the bear. But ultimately, that's how the process works, is that you don't waive your either one. You're ultimately, if that's what's happening and you can't continue to serve and you're deemed unfit for an in the line of duty condition, it may benefit you to go through. I have somebody who sent me an email outside of this. Let's not do that, but I'll answer it. In terms of this person has an 80% rating from, they were medically retired and they have 100% VA and they're asking if they will get concurrent receipt. Not based on those facts alone. You may be eligible based on the things that you were rated 80% for, if any of those are considered combat related. If you apply for combat related compensation, you may be entitled to additional payment, but not on those facts alone.
There's one in here about VA. First of all, you can appeal the VA service connection issue with or without going to a reserve unit for additional documentation. So if the VA denies something that you believe was in the line of duty in the first place, then certainly, again, you can appeal it through the VA. If you're still in and it's appropriate, you could certainly also ask for documentation from your own unit. I would contend that, again, if you have an LOD from the military, the VA should be accepting it, doesn't go in reverse. But you should probably want an LOD regardless of whether the VA is saying it. But if you're no longer in, then you're going to try to get buddy statements and appeal the VA side that way. And we are wrapping up, generally speaking, here. So I believe most of these others are very, very specific questions. Did I miss any? Sorry,
yeah, a lot of them are either duplicates or things that are far too specific and or things that are much more related to a different topic area, like specifically VA or specifically other types of retirements.
And there's one here asking about basically being removed before an MEB and pushed through an ETS. If you're profiled for a pretty long period of time and you believe you should not have been released from the Army, if you think you were still, again, if you were unfit and should have been an MEB, you believe that, it's worth consulting with someone about. There is not enough information to answer the question. But if you are unfit at the time of being released from active duty, again, that's something it's a gray area. You want to talk to someone as to whether you have a shot. There's just too many factors to answer the individual questions.
Talking about is, and it's something that we often help our clients with, is that it's not always just a situation where we're appealing what the formal PEB or informal PEB did. Sometimes we're ultimately going to the Board of Corrections because the person was never referred to begin with, and there was evidence that should have supported that happened. Now, again, is there ever a guarantee, and is it a magic wand? No, but there are many situations where it is a circumstance where the facts may dictate that they got it wrong, they did something. And that's ultimately what the boards of correction are looking at. They're looking at what they either call error, which is legal error, or injustice, which is kind of the more equitable situations. But injustice doesn't mean that it's just unfair. It really means that it's, it's kind of, it doesn't meet the spirit of the law such that it's not in the interest of the service branch to maintain. All right, well, there were a lot of really great questions here, and I hope that provided some information. It's a very dense topic, and obviously from these questions, we've seen that obviously people have a lot of personal issues to address, that they may obviously want to seek out, an individual opportunity to speak about them to determine whether or not it's worthy of them pursuing or whether they need help in the process that they're currently going on, and that's what we do. So please feel free to reach out and potentially have a conversation about your individual circumstances based on what you've learned here today. Thank you all. It was a pleasure to speak with everyone.